Hi there, this is the second part of my commentary on the Jonathan Pageau and Adam Friended interview or dialogue from a couple of weeks ago at this point. So I think before I even begin this commentary, I should talk about some of the basics of the metaphysics of quality for people who are here looking at this due to Jonathan and or Adam's work, because I tend to focus what I'm saying on people who are interested in Pirsig's work and who probably understand some of the basic concepts. And I think this is to the detriment of anyone else, so I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to run a basic overview based on what's important to me in Pirsig's work now. It's not a full overview. It's how I'm understanding it now, and in a way that's related to this interview. So Robert Pirsig was the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He only wrote 2 novels, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila, and both of them took a very long time to write. Lila, the second one, took about 20 years. In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he describes a genius by the name of Phaedrus who develops a new metaphysics in which he determines that was a metaphysics that was originally the way the pre-Socratics looked at the world in terms of excellence or in terms of quality. In this conception of reality, in this worldview, in this metaphysical worldview, value holds the highest place. Plato, countering the pre-Socratics, the rhetoricians, with dialectic sleight of hand, and then later with Aristotle, who codified what Plato arrived at, puts into place a materialist conception of the world, one in which substance is the base of reality. The rediscovery of Aristotle in the Middle Ages is the beginning of a substance-oriented conception of reality, the one we use today, in which every educated person pretty much believes that subatomic particles somehow make up the reality that we see today, and that objects are in the world just waiting to be discovered. That is generally the subject-object framework. In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he notices the difference in attitude between people who are oriented around art and surface-level presentation and the way things are, versus, and he called these romantics, versus people who are oriented around the structure of things, the underlying structure, what things mean. And these were the classic-oriented people, people who saw things through the classic lens. And he tried to unify these two viewpoints, and it became such an obsession that it eventually does him in mentally. In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, much of his explorations are by example, but in Lila, he tends to spell out the theory more in a fairly linear way and then transpose examples in alternating chapters, more or less, to kind of explain how the theory looks in the world. Whereas in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he walks you through how he arrives at his conclusion that quality is at the pinnacle of reality. Everything comes from quality rather than subjects and objects. But he does it more in a narrative way. So quality, according to the metaphysics of quality, which is how he identifies his theory in Lila in the second book, Metaphysics of Quality, quality is the root of everything. It is the stimulus of quality, of what's better, that inspires any kind of creativity at all. And when I say any kind of creativity, anything at all that's ever created is stimulated by quality in order to create. So quality is the base reality. And quality inspires a move toward anything that will allow more freedom, meaning from the very first atom that joined with another atom to create a molecule, the drive towards improvement is also the drive towards more freedom. So quality is one, but it has 2 forces, and one of them is dynamic quality, the other is static quality. Dynamic quality evolved from that notion of romantic, and static quality evolved from that notion of classic. Dynamic quality is awareness of value. And when I say awareness, it is anything, even an atom, can be aware of quality, can make a drive towards or away from something. In living beings, it's pre-intellectual. Value just happens. So dynamic quality inspires an analog or static quality or static pattern of value. Dynamic goes to what's better, and then it manifests in a static pattern. Anything in the dictionary is a static pattern of value, from a molecule to the most lofty philosophical concept. Something you can identify, categorize, that's a static pattern of value. And that's how quality creates the universe. Nothing gets done or made, nothing happens that's not originally inspired by quality. Since the Big Bang, there have evolved 4 levels of static patterns of value, according to his theory. The first is inorganic, which after billions of years learned how to use carbon molecules as vehicles to turn into life. And organisms created societies, and societies allowed for the development of intellect. So there are 4 patterns of value: inorganic, biological, social, and intellectual. The lower levels support the higher levels, but operate independently, and that's really important. So a beautiful analogy for this independence, for this interrelatedness and independence, can be found in chapter 12 of Lila, and this is on page 174 of this Aqua book. And he says, an excellent analogy to the independence of the levels, Fiedler's thought, is the relation of hardware to software in the computer. So he's talking about how when you actually work on the circuits, that has nothing to do with the when you're working on the hardware, even though it's the same computer, that has nothing to do with the software and the programming, which has nothing to do with what the applications are used for. And all these things exist in a computer, but on completely independent levels, although they all support each other. And let's talk about, and then he ends up talking about a novel that's written in a word processing program. And he says about the interrelationship of static patterns of quality or of value. The novel cannot exist in the computer without a parallel pattern of voltages to support it. But that does not mean that the novel is an expression or property of these voltages. It doesn't have to exist in any electronic circuits at all. It can also reside in magnetic domains, or on a disc, or a drum. Okay, remember this is in the 80s and 90s. Or a tape, but again is not composed of magnetic domains, nor is it possessed by them. It's not composed of them or possessed by them. It can reside in a notebook, but it is not composed of or possessed by the ink and paper. It can reside in the brain of a programmer, but even here it's neither composed of this brain nor possessed by it. So the novel is independent of all these levels, of the inorganic, of the biological, the brain of the programmer, of the societal, the fact that a novel is shared in society, but the novel itself is an intellectual pattern of value. So intellect is the highest and most valuable pattern of value. So when there's a conflict between one level and another, it is moral in the general sense of things for the upper level to take precedence. So it's more moral to kill an animal than it is, which exists on the biological level, than it is to kill a human being. And a social norm such as marriage is more valuable than a biological one, such as adultery. But that part we're not going to get into too much, because all that moral stuff becomes very complicated, and I haven't studied it enough. So here's how complicated it gets. When does a nation, for example, count as a social pattern, and when does it count as a conglomerate of living beings, each with its own capacity for ideas? So depending on the context, you might see it as a social pattern, or you might see it as an intellectual pattern. And even Pirsig says this can go on and on and on. This is all in chapter 13 of Lila. And I think a lot of the online Pirsig forums kind of concentrated on this very complex juxtaposition of all the levels that you can come up with, and it can be pretty indefinite, because at that point you really have categorized things enough to the sense that it can go on and on and on. But the thing to take away about the moral systems, again, is that each level has its own morality, and they are often in conflict. Only the human contains all 4, obviously, because we're the only species who has transcended biology into the intellectual realm. So Christianity, as Pageau conceives it, is consonant with metaphysics of quality in the sense that its based on a cosmological framework, which is a direct metaphorical interpretation of this metaphysics of reality, the metaphysics of quality, which is based on value, not on atoms. What also makes Pageau's conception of Christianity based on this cosmological framework, the language of creation, we call it, which is what his brother's book is called, which is definitely worth reading if you want to understand what Pageau is talking about, is that this type of Christianity is a very, very high quality pattern of social value, that it is durable and flexible. And one thing about high quality patterns of value, which I should mention, is that they are both durable, they can withstand attack, and they're flexible, they can take in elements of change in order to update. So that is extremely important in a high quality static pattern of value. And Jonathan is going to try to explain the fact that Christianity, despite the fact that it looks rigid to a lot of people, especially scientific-minded people, atheists, that it really is very flexible. And Adam is alternately seeing only two levels. He's seeing the biological and the intellectual level. I think occasionally he makes some forays into the inorganic, but mostly because he's evolutionary. He's an evolutionary biologist, or at least that's his framework, is evolutionary biology. That's the framework that makes the most sense to him in interpreting reality, that he tends to live in the biological intellectual levels and is missing the reality of the social level and the social biological level. And in the social biological level, this is where you're going to find Christian morality. And he's really, and I mean, when I say social biological, it means how the social manages the biological. So I'm going to read something from chapter 13 of Lila, because we're going to start talking about morality in Christianity. What the evolutionary structure of the metaphysics of quality shows is that there is not just one moral system, there are many. In the metaphysics of quality, there is a morality called the laws of nature, by which inorganic patterns triumph over chaos. There's a morality called the law of the jungle, where biology triumphs over the inorganic forces of starvation and death. There's a morality where the social patterns triumph over biology, the law. And there is an intellectual morality which is still struggling in its attempts to control society. Each of these sets of moral codes is no more related to the other than novels are to flip-flops. Flip-flops meaning an early type of computer circuit, meaning the hardware. And then he says, what is today conventionally called morality covers only one of these sets of moral codes, the social biological code. This is the morality you're going to find in Christianity. In a subject-object metaphysics, this single social biological code is considered to be minor, subjective, physically non-existent part of the universe. But in the metaphysics of quality, all these sets of morals plus another dynamic morality are not only real, they are the whole thing. So the morality, the social biological morality of Christianity that Jonathan is referring to when he talks about moral, is just as real as any other moral code, including the laws of nature. And this is something that the scientists have a very hard time understanding, because they completely ignore the significance of the social level. And I should mention dynamic morality. This is the flexibility we're talking about. The flexibility manifests, dynamic quality manifests as flexibility in a system.
But I think Don Hoffman makes a mistake. He makes a mistake in his original premise, which is fine because he's a scientist. But he makes a mistake in his original premise, which is that we experience illusions, and there is this other thing behind, which is more true than what we experience,
right?
But we can't experience it. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. Why don't you posit your experience as the first frame and then the rest as secondary? So like the experience that we have, that's all our meaning is made out of it. Like all our meaning is made out of that experience. And so I'm not saying that scientific truths are untrue. Of course they're true, but they're secondary to that first experience. Like you don't experience H2O. You experience wet. You experience cold. These are the first categories. And they're not subjective, they're personal, like, because they're human experiences, but everybody it's a universal personal experience. But you don't experience molecules, you don't experience atoms, you don't experience the solar system. Like you all of these things are abstractions from your experience, and they're useful and they're valuable, but they come after the first experience.
In this clip, John says something funny. It's fine that the scientist is making a mistake because he's a scientist, and he's right, because scientists typically, probably 99.9% of the time, are making that leap from organic to intellectual. Like behind anything at all is some organic framework as atoms. Seeing biology as emergent from atoms and social patterns as intellectual constructions like parasitic memes, or describing these underlying structures like Hoffman does behind the illusions, that are somehow emergent in nature. And what Jonathan is expressing is essentially the metaphysics of quality. He's talking about the pre-intellectual awareness of quality, of value. That experience as a scientist quality value inspires you to posit this hypothesis. So the moment of quality awareness that Jonathan is referring to is the same whether you're a mystic or a chemistry professor. And that is a way of describing this underlying pattern. And this parallels exactly with the language of creation, which we will get into in a minute, how it does that.
First of all, like I said, one of the difficulties that religion is not first and foremost an ethical package. It is a communal package. It's a package which makes us know that we are in communion with each other, that we have things in common that help us to see each other as together. So you could see it that way.
Everything that you're saying goes along with my beliefs. Yeah. Maybe the term ethical package is incorrect,
and in that there's a hierarchy of practices.
Sure, yeah.
And so there are things which are high up on the normative ladder, and there are things which are low on the normative ladder, and there are things which are considered sinful. Now, the thing about the sinful part is that everybody sins.
Yeah.
It's not like there's a particular type of person that sins and everybody else doesn't. Sin is just a normal part of reality. And so the idea that certain behaviors are prescribed as sinful doesn't mean that they don't exist, because everybody sins. And that's one of the aspects of Christianity, is to say, don't judge your neighbor, don't judge the other, because you also have that in you.
The way that you're framing this is completely offensive to the atheist. I want you to know, because you're I'm asking you about
It's so much better though, because you don't have the totalitarian move in what I'm saying. There's no totalitarian move.
Here Jonathan is telling us that religion is in the social level. And the practices within this pattern of value called Christianity, or religion in general, is that social patterns manage biological threat at their essence. And this is why all the vices that Jonathan points to are threatening to society. And Adam can agree on this, of course, because it's got this biological component that Adam understands. But what Adam is missing is that in the morality of the social level, the morality of the social level is different, not better or worse than the morality of the intellectual level. Just because the intellectual level is the highest level of evolution doesn't mean that it's not always existing with the social level. The levels themselves are equally real and valid, and the morality of these levels are equally real and valid. And when you discount the morality of one level, then you miss a lot of the picture, and you're going to have to go straight to looking for the answer at an earlier level, and you're not going to get a full picture of reality. Christianity manages both the social reality of the biological threat and the intellectual reality of a high-quality idea such as equality. The first person to posit any meaningful social understanding of the idea of equality was Christ. And Christianity is also flexible enough to acknowledge that the actual, not metaphorical, not intellectual, but actual morality of the biological level, enough to realize that it's there and we have to accept that it's there, and we must not undermine the biological level because we need it to support the social level. Remember that these levels support each other. And perhaps a more fundamentalist Christian might think that you can somehow remove biological threat if you're good enough, if you're holy enough. Or a scientist might think that, for that matter, that you can do that through science. But in Pageau's Christianity, the way he describes it, to respect the independence and manage of the biological level and manage it with social patterns is a much better way of seeing things. And this is why sin is both prescribed and accepted at the same time. If you don't acknowledge the separate moralities of the levels, you're not going to see this. And this is why Adam keeps trying to argue on the evolutionary, biological, and on the intellectual level, because he sees them as linear, conjoined, beginning in particles, or I'm kind of using Adam as a foil for people in the subject-object understanding. I mean, Adam's actually, a very open-minded guy, so I don't mean to rag on him. But Adam is seeing this as a linear progression all the way, beginning with particles, and not as separate but supporting levels. Because again, he's not seeing value as the first principle. And this is why the viewer called Paul Go, in the comment to Jonathan on my last video, said that the problem that Jonathan's having with Adam is really a categorical error.
There always have been people who do that. That's not like,
yeah, but they
Christian
aren't
society
welcome
didn't have people
inside the
who did
Christian. They aren't welcome inside the Christian church, though. They're.
You think prostitutes don't go to communion once a year?
Well, okay. We're getting away from my point here. My point.
No, it's important. It's a really important. It's because we're so used to like weird totalitarian systems.
So Christ sat down with the prostitutes and the lepers and the thieves, and he was the first to do so in any way that really populated our mythos. He is the first ghost in our mythos that gives us the idea that we're equal. Intellectually, Adam is just seeing the lack of equality in Christianity, but that's not the case at all. Christianity was founded on the idea of this man who said, we are all going to sit down together at the table. In Christianity, we as human beings are equal, but we have these threatening biological urges. So what you do is you do your best, which is why Christ says, go and sin no more. And this is why we have forgiveness. If you don't have forgiveness for having biological urges outside, say, procreation and sustenance, then you undermine the biological urges themselves. The biological level has to be kept dynamic in order to be supportive. It has to be kept alive, but managed. A perfect example of what happens when you undermine the level below you, say the way the social justice warriors undermine the social morality, the social biological morality of Christianity that they hate so much, or of the establishment, or whatever it is, the social level. They're trying to deconstruct the social level, results in becoming unmoored from the interrelatedness of the levels. And this can only result in one thing, which is fragmentation. You don't have any foundation anymore. And this is exactly what we're seeing happening.
The system, the thing that I'm talking about, the system for interaction between systems.
Yeah, but you would need to. So if you want to create something which navigates
a super system, let's call it the super system.
The problem with the super system is that it's being brought about by people who aren't aware that the system is not arbitrary.
Nobody's driving the ship now, John.
Exactly.
Come on.
And so I'm afraid of anybody who wants to place themselves above the systems. Like, I'm really afraid of that, because they have a blind side. Like they're blinded by something, and that they think that they can stand outside.
So Adam is talking about an interface between levels. And obviously, evolutionary psychology and biology is better than looking at everything from a deterministic, inorganic level. which is why, which is part of the reason it seems like evolutionary biology seems very high quality compared to this deterministic, atomistic point of view. It actually does take into consideration biology, so it's a little bit more advanced, you can say, in terms of if you're going to compare it to metaphysics of quality. So it's and people who are oriented towards value can see the difference between an evolutionarily oriented system and a completely inorganic, atomistic oriented system. It is a more high quality way of looking at things if you're looking at the interrelatedness of levels. The trouble is he's trying to use this idea of better, of social betterness, because he doesn't because he's not looking at, he's missing the absolute reality of the social level to create a top-down set of values. That's his super system. You know, you get all the best people with the best intentions, and we create a top-down set of rules for everyone because all these other rules are so bad. So what Pageau counters is that the pattern of reality is what needs to be driving how we solve the problems today. The fragmentation, the meaning crisis, however you want to express it, needs to be solved with the unfolding of the actual pattern of reality. We don't need to force a bunch of intellectual rules on society. We need to let the societal level and the intellectual level evolve in a way that's more integrated. This was Pirsig was saying, this is what's going on in the 20th and into the 21st century. Although, of course, if you're looking at some of the more ominous stuff, the intellectual level is becoming, again, unmoored from the social, and that's very problematic. Pageau proposes that society will do it for itself, and this happens. I'm going to refer to another Pageau video. He says that the cycle, the cosmic cycle, says that once things fall apart and fragment, they will regroup and reorient. So Pirsig acknowledges, I read earlier that Pirsig acknowledges this battle and expresses, that this is what's going on. And what we need is some kind of integration, because there's too much unmooring, because the intellectual level is just so compelling.
Brett's argument is there are all these ethical systems. They all believe different and contradictory things. Science is the only one that can discern truth among those things in a materialist way. Therefore, if truth is really what you're looking for, because there's also well-being, like one system may be terrible at truth, but they're very good at well-being. Like the people who live there are very happy. None of them believe anything in the real world, but they're so happy. They're producing kids. They're thriving over time. So one of the things that I'm always talking about is one of the ironies of the world is where like truth and well-being often diverge. So the anti-theist community, they want to see truth and well-being be on the same page, but that's not necessarily how the world works. So, but you understand the argument that Brett is making. You're just making kind of a technical.
I definitely disagree.
Okay, so how do you disagree?
I disagree because the jump between different levels of all reality is not a scientific jump. Mm-hmm. You have to take a category for granted before you analyze it. Mm-hmm. The analysis of a category will not give you the category.
But you analyze it how? Because Brett would say
science is taking bounded phenomena and then giving a description, mm-hmm. which is good enough so that maybe you can predict what's going to happen, mm-hmm. right? And so you bound a phenomena and then you describe it in a way that is so good that then you can actually predict other versions of it or how it's going to act, let's say, or how it's going to continue. Right. And so that is what scientific things do. But the category of a car is not a scientific category. Mm-hmm. You need the category first before you analyze the car. You need the category of a mountain before you analyze a mountain.
Okay.
The world is fluid. Like the boundaries between phenomena are permeable.
But there are different ways to analyze a category, though.
Sorry?
There are different ways to analyze a category.
Right, but the science, all it does is analyze the categories.
For truth
But the categories are not scientific themselves.
Science only analyzes for materialist truth claims. That's all it analyzes for.
For it analyzes for factuality.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't give you even the categories. Mm-hmm. It's like a river is a category of meaning. So if you're going to study what lives in a river, a species are, it's like, why do we think that species, we have we have meaningful ways of differentiating species, but those are not you can't find them in the actual analysis of the category.
It is value, of course, that allows the scientist to even formulate the parameters that make sense within the mythos of science. So if you want to use Zen in the Art of Motorcycle metaphor, whatever the scientist has in his boxcars, and I can't remember what this is, it's the train metaphor, which really is fantastic. The boxcars are experience, education, biology, and you are the train on the quality track. And quality is guiding you, but you can only manifest quality with whatever you've got in your boxcars. So the scientist is using whatever he's got in his boxcars to inform how he determines what will be the valuable parameters in which to conduct scientific experience. The quality will determine, the quality itself, the interaction of his boxcars with what's best, with that quality, that dynamic quality experience, will determine what in the scientist's boxcars can formulate a good description of the category he wants to analyze. What is his hypothesis of the category he wants to analyze, or what is his hypothesis? And then he goes forth on the quality track, which is leading him to scientific truth, which is leading to his hypothesis lining up with evidence and producing factuality. Within the parameters, within those parameters, then you can say yes, no, on, off, good, evil, or whatever. No, you wouldn't say good or evil in science, but maybe you would in some ways. But overall, in the totality of being, the only phenomenon or thing that possesses, now let's talk about truth, the only thing that possesses this unwavering truth that science is looking for is that moment of value awareness, which is another way to illustrate the difference between a value-based reality and an object-based reality. The scientist is looking for some way to describe most accurately the object, and a value-based reality is looking for the best way to manifest this pre-intellectual moment of quality, which is the only truth in a metaphysics of quality. So for a scientist, that moment of truth is when the hypothesis lines up factually with evidence. For a mathematician, it may be the emergence of the best fact. Because of the completely cognition and ego-free nature of that pre-intellectual awareness, within a religious frame, this experience is the voice of God telling you what to do next. And you could argue it's the voice of God for everyone, really, but that's a different video.
What would be your rebuttal? What would be your argument? So, or your rebuttal to Brett's argument. So if Brett is saying that science is the only way that you can study the truth claims between the various ethical systems or religions, whatever you want to call them, and he's saying that's why that is the defining factor of science over the different systems. You're saying no, science is. You're saying what is the highest?
Science is at the bottom of the hierarchy, but in a good way, not in a bad way.
At the bottom of the hierarchy,
in a very good way, because what it does is it helps you understand how things work, right? And so, for example, like the top, let's say a car, right? The top of a interacting with a car is, why does the car exist? Like it's to go. You need to driving a car is higher in the hierarchy.
Transportation is higher
than understanding how it works. Right? Driving the car is higher in the hierarchy than understanding how it works. If you don't understand how it works, obviously you're going to have a problem driving it. But the reason why you even want to understand how the car works is because you have a goal. You have a
utility.
You have a telos.
Yeah, utility.
Yeah.
So what?
And so that's what I think is higher. It's just inevitably higher on any hierarchy of meaning has to be purpose.
This is consonant where Pirsig places rationality. Rationality is an excellent tool to create the highest quality analogs of the quality event. This pre-intellectual moment of quality, of awareness of quality, is called the quality event. If you know how to properly maintain your motorcycle, you will have the smoothest and most problem-free ride. If you're using rationality correctly, that is, if you're respecting it as a tool but don't elevate it to the top. Rationality is at the top in subject-object metaphysics, or rather how subjects and objects interact with each other mechanically, and trying to describe that in the best possible way.
Yeah. And science is a different way of interacting with people and the world. There is a hierarchy there that Brett Weinstein would say science is at the top of the hierarchy because science can explain the workings of Christianity and of Scientology in a way that Scientology cannot explain the workings of science and Christianity.
Perfect expression of subject-object metaphysics, putting objects and their relationships at the top.
Like,
specifically, what does logos mean specifically?
It just means, the reason for things. Mm-hmm. And the reason for things appear in the way that they're ordered. So mm-hmm. It has to do with reason in the sense that we understand. And so the order of something. Mm-hmm. So the order of something is bound up in its reason, mm-hmm. right? The order of the chair is bound up in the reason why the chair exists.
Correct. Yeah.
The utility that it has in the world. The thing that's above the hierarchy is the logos. It's not Christianity.
Okay, so that's what I want to get at right there. So what is above all science, Scientology, and Christianity? What is that thing?
Well, the divine logos. Like the divine logos is the reason and mm-hmm. origin and end of things. Mm-hmm. And those that you could see it as the highest version, but that scales down all the way down to anything you can identify. And so every category mm-hmm. in terms of every category has an unitive aspect to it, mm-hmm. right? Has something which makes you know that it's one.
Right.
Even though it has parts.
Okay.
And so I know that's hard. It's so hard.
I know we have to dumb it down to atheist speak here. You really have to give me the materialist version of it.
Okay.
Because I understand how metaphors work.
So it's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor in the simple sense. So let's say
logos is a very interesting thing when understood through the lens of metaphysics of quality. There is a void, the void in Genesis from which light emerges, from which logos emerges. Or that void in the Tao Te Ching, or of absolute monism. Into this void comes value, or quality, or logos, or Tao. This is not metaphorical. This is how it is. It's how what is can become that. This is the ability, let's just say, the logos is the ability to discern. It's an awakening. So this logos is the introduction of movement into the void, or duality into the monism, and this creates the universe. Once the movement is there, the movement is always toward or away from, which means it's a force, which means value, which means purpose. That movement toward or away is a purpose. Even in standard cosmology, there was a Big Bang. Once logos is introduced, it is the way of everything. Quality creates everything, and I hope this is starting to make sense, and I'm talking to myself when I say that too. So now that I'm thinking about it, Tao Te Ching might be another book that might help Adam understand Jonathan. Tao Te Ching is a really good mystical and rational text that helps people understand this alternate metaphysics.
Let's say it's harder for smaller things because they see them physically together. So a chair is a good example. So a chair has parts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, and those parts also have parts.
Yeah. No, it's a conceptual category.
Those parts also have parts. Okay. So why do you think that a chair is one thing?
Well, it's based on the utility of the chair, obviously.
Yeah.
Once a certain amount of matter coalesces in a way that it has a certain utility, we start categorizing it by that utility. You're talking to a Jordan Peterson fan here.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, we want the drill for what it does. We want the hole that the drill puts in the wall. Yeah. We don't care necessarily about the drill. It's about the utility.
Right. And so that is not a scientific description. Right. The reason why something exists is not a scientific description of that thing. You could bring it into a scientific description of something above it, but not of the thing itself.
It's a description based on value, and this is where Adam is getting it. If he could extract this from Jordan, he's kind of getting it. Jordan was unbelievably helpful to me with this concept. Really, in a way, it was an introduction to this alternate metaphysics for me. So if Adam is understanding this from Jordan, then, you know, he's on the right track.
The category of all chairs are not physically together.
What?
Right. But all chairs share an identity. Like they are a body and they have a logos, which is above the individual chairs.
Right.
And so that truth is higher than the analysis of what a chair is made of.
So you're saying what's at the top of the hierarchy is just the system that we categorize things by.
It's the reason,
the ability to categorize things.
Yeah, something like that. You could, I mean, I could go that far.
The ability.
Adam says just a system. This is how static patterns happen. They are inspired by dynamic quality, the purpose.
Oh, we realize that other animals use tools all the time. I don't see how you can look at the elaborate nests birds make and think, oh yeah, we're the only species that uses tools.
Yeah.
So, but you're.
No, I think logos definitely goes down into the chain of
what
being.
is.
That is a beautiful description of how value creates reality. So I think I'll be appropriating Jonathan's description here when I'm trying to explain this concept in the future, trying to answer the question, how does quality create reality? This is an extremely useful way to logically understand a value-based reality.
Is there anything above the category system in the hierarchy?
Yes.
Okay. Oh my God.
God.
Okay.
That's what God does. God is beyond category. God is infinite. That's the reason why we say things like God is infinite, or God is beyond all name, all definition, because God is the darkness out of which the categories come from. The divine darkness is
God creates the categories. God is the impetus behind the categories.
The God creates the categories through the logos.
This is how I finally came to the conclusion that God made sense. What is behind the Big Bang, behind the void, behind the monism? What infuses this void with logos? I guess you could say yes to Adam, that God is the impetus behind the categories. If you want to say that the Word of God, the logos, creates all categories of everything in the universe. The void represents the infinity in which we are necessarily suspended as limited beings. Even though the scientists keep trying to dig down and down and down, they will never find the smallest, and no rocket will ever find the biggest. They will never get to the end of this because we are suspended in infinity, try as they may. All we're going to find is the end of our perception, and our perception may grow in quality, let's just say, or we may be able to conceptualize a smaller particle or a larger universe, but there will always be infinity above and underneath. There is no way to understand infinity. We can't. It is limitlessness, and we are limited. The only way we can really understand this in any way that makes sense as human beings is as God. So that means the sky fairy conception of God just falls away. It no longer makes sense in this greatest of the great conception. So I guess the metaphysics of quality made a theist out of me. I wonder what Pirsig would say. Well, he said that God and good seem to have the same etymological root, so enough said.
Donald Hoffman, really quick, makes an argument that the real world is very different than the world that we see and understand. That we have what is effectively a user interface, a graphical user interface like you use with your computer. Many different operations are going on inside your computer than what we see on depicted on the screen. We all understand the screen of the computer very well, and he postulates that all of science for as long as we've been studying the natural world, all we've been studying is the screen, the user interface, and we've never looked inside the computer to what's actually going on.
One great thing about Hoffman is that he is describing our intellectual perception as independent of the other levels of reality, like I was talking about before. This is a really, I'm going to put a link to a TED Talk where he talks about this stuff. It's a really good talk. It's very metaphysics of quality. Also, it parallels our way of seeing reality, the way our interface into reality that he talks about, parallels Vervaeke's relevance realization, which is just such an amazingly useful concept. And it does describe the pre-intellectual awareness of quality from a scientific point of view. But Hoffman seems to explain away value as some kind of fixed, imperceptible reality, the real source of cause and effect, he says, behind our consciousness, and that our perceptions are not reality. And he's trying to prove this scientifically. However, if you replace the term the real source of reality with the word value, then his theory does make sense. After all, why has the universe acted as though value is the real thing? Forever, from the beginning, from the first Big Bang, from the moment Logos, introduced light into the void. Pirsig demonstrates in a few sentences in chapter 11 of Lila how subatomic forces value carbon molecules as a vehicle towards freedom, towards better, towards increasing their agency. So Hoffman is doing what Jonathan says, which Jonathan points to what, for example, Rationality Rules was trying to do, which is go outside the value which is the totality of reality, to explain value. You can't do it. It's like pulling like Alan Watts said, it's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So I just want to say a word about consciousness. I propose consciousness begins with that light in Genesis, with that very first movement out of the void. And 3.5 billion years later, this is manifested as the consciousness we know in a living creature. That toward or away from, or even decision to remain neutral in the mu state, for example, and again, see chapter 26 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is consciousness.
Categories are as essential to us understanding the world as pixels are on the screen. Like if you don't have pixels, you don't have a user interface.
The user interface is value. Relevance realization is a good way to describe it. And this plays into relevance realization being intelligence, which of course can explain how someone who is able to find higher quality patterns of value more relevant will probably pass their genes on more successfully.
So the Aristotelian or even Christian way of positing it would say that behind it is chaos, potential. Mm-hmm. It's a potentiality. And then logos, light, logos comes down on potentiality and then forms identities into that potentiality. And those identities are the realest thing. Because the potentiality is just potentiality.
Instead of chaos, could you say raw materials?
When you say raw materials, that kind of sounds like inorganic static patterns of value, which again is the frame that someone scientifically minded like Adam is using to make sense of what John is saying.
The thing that bothers me is people are dismissive. That's what bothers me, because there's absolutely no attempt to even understand. So,
and I'd like to end with this because I think Adam is open-minded again and, has the right attitude. He's not dismissive. So he needs a little loosening of that value trap of evolutionary biology. So let me read something from chapter 26 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. This is about the Indian rice trap, in which they put rice inside a gourd and they put a little hole in it, and a little monkey puts his hand inside, grabs the rice, but can't pull his hand out because his hand is now bigger because it's holding rice. The monkey reaches in and is suddenly trapped by nothing more than his own value rigidity. He can't revalue the rice. He cannot see that freedom without rice is more valuable than capture with it. The villagers are coming to get him and take him away. They're coming closer, now. What general advice, not specific advice, but what general advice would you give the poor monkey in circumstances like this? Well, I think you might say exactly what I've been saying about value rigidity. with perhaps a little extra urgency. There is a fact the monkey should know. If he opens his hands, he's free. But how is he going to discover this fact? By removing the value rigidity that values rice above freedom. You don't need to give up science. You just need to see it for what it is, a very high quality intellectual pattern of value that helps us out a lot, that helps us live long lives, which are fairly free from the threat of biology. And one that you can still practice as a scientist and still embrace a value-based metaphysics. The value metaphysics that Christianity Jonathan is talking about does not mean you can't be a scientist and believe in science. It just means that science is nested in religion. There's a reason Einstein believed in God. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.
He's really wrestling with these questions existentially, and so that's what it is. So I think that he's not an atheist, but I think that he doesn't have faith.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it that way. That is, there's a difference between saying that you believe that God refers to something which has value, let's say something like that, and faith, which is a celebration of that which is above you and a participation in that story. So those two things are different.